who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Very, very powerful, powerful words that bring back a rush of energy. And when you are in a state of epilepsy and you sound these words, you can see the energy rushing back to you. And the energy itself tries to take shapes because it is made up of devas. And all that I've been talking about there have been devic forces trying to fashion shapes out of something sounded into them. They see what we hear. When we make a sound, they see it. And they rush to copy it. They rush to copy it. And so, when you present sacred words to the inner world, this is the sort of phenomenon that you must expect. The sounding of the word, you may even sing. Certain songs, like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and especially Land of Hope and Glory, are lines which are immortalized. Immortalized because they have tremendous numinostic value attached to them. This was brought home to me so frequently during the war years, when merely out of an act of necessity, I used to recite poetry. Recite poetry to myself, couldn't be allowed, had to be silent, and after reciting poems, sonnets, I was energized unbelievably, so that I knew there was something strange going on. And it wasn't that I was just reciting poetry which was patriotic and was stirring me deeply, although that works in the same way. It was that the poetry being sounded was attracting what I'm talking about here. And certain forms of poetry are more powerful than others. The sonnets are extremely powerful, especially the Shakespearean type of sonnet, which is rhyming pentameters, iambic pentameters. And so all of us can learn to energize ourselves. And it has been given to me to be able to observe some of the repercussions of feeding devices into the unconscious. Now when you look at some of the meditational procedures which are taught by ignorant yogis, they are not aware of what they're doing. And the sounding of mantras, we begin to understand that we can present things to the unconscious which will bring back a flow of energy which might be therapeutic, or an energy that may come back and open a particular chakra. And this is absolutely true. And a whole lot of work needs to be done in this respect, and there must be astrological indications for it. And it could be possible to look at a horoscope and say that such and such a chakra requires, or can obtain a flow of energy from the unconscious. Would that we knew what the energy triggers were. Let me give you some of those that were elaborated from my own experience. D is da did it. D is da did it. And presented to the unconscious as D, back comes D, E, E. Like a parent and two children. And so, when you begin to present questions to the unconscious, you must expect your intuition to be receptive to this sort of thing. I would call it the morphology, the associated morphology of the particular sound. D. And the next thing that came was a river. And in England, one of the most famous rivers in England is the River Dee. The miller on the River Dee. Then the next thing was two moons. Two moons representing D. Here's your D. Two moons representing D. At the same time as this vision of two moons making up the letter D. The music. Dinner in the diner, nothing could be finer than eating ham and eggs in Carolina. D, dinner in the diner. Why? The moon rules the serving of meals, dinner in the diner. Now, if you can grasp that, if you can grasp this sort of thing, you will understand the tremendous difficulty that Jung had to try and explain the relevancy of the unconscious to mankind. In the hands of a non-expert lecturer, this sounds completely and utterly daft. But all those things are part of one dynamic image, which constantly presents itself anew and constantly reflects meaning. Images that are in a state of dynamic equilibrium with a basic input, and so on. The letter E, a dot, only a dot, immediately comes back as a baby all on its own. A baby all on its own. Embryo, E, embryo. Tiny embryo that we see inside anything from a frog's egg up to the human embryo. Anthropogeny. Anthropogeny. And so you could go on, and I think this work should one day be taken up by some of you. Did-ah-dit, ah. Dit-da-dit, ah. Did-ah-dit. Did-ah-dit. In Morse code, it represents received. Received. Did-ah-dit. And if the higher consciousness was going to signal back to you, I have received your communication, I acknowledge what you have put to me in your diary. He might not send back did, which is the currently accepted radio method of acknowledging receipt, but something else might come back, and you may miss it. IRA, which has a meaning to the Englishman, not to the American. So what we're beginning to understand now is that just as there are complexes of ideas and images laden with energy, a complex which is impinging on human consciousness, there are minor, very, very minor complexes. In fact, what we are doing is taking a complex and breaking it down into its fragments. Now, you must get out of the idea of thinking that what is good in this world is good for the next, or for the unconscious. It isn't. Didadit, meaning received, that sort of impression might mean to the Englishman IRA. And what is being signaled back is to say that complexes are made up of all sorts of symbols which have an affinity with each other. And so going right beyond Jung, we're looking into the nature of the complex, which can be a conjugation of ideas, of images, instincts, numinostic energy, and we're looking into what these components are made of. And so, to sum up, I want all of you to think again about what you expect to be returned to you when you put a question in your spiritual diary to the Master, to the higher self. And I believe that most of you are getting answers but cannot recognize them. Cannot recognize them because you have not understood that the input does not bring back an image which is necessarily meaningful to you at first glance. And when I asked Browning once what was the most important factor about learning all these masses of images, he said, to bring out the intuition of the youngsters on the path so that they can be prepared for group initiation. And that really is what this whole talk was all about, was to beg you to look again. There is nothing more disheartening than to set something up, to get quietness, peace of mind, to have your question all ready, to present it to the unconscious or to the higher self, and to get back a feedback which to you seems irrelevant. You expect something to come back that's going to fit into your narrow little personality. Just as in our astrology we assemble permutations of images And I know that when we get to book 8, 9, and 10, 11, 12 of esoteric astrology, we will then begin to get the highest possible permutations given that I am not permitted at the moment to give. And the later books, the very later, the last books in the series, will give the highest permutations, meanings of the most basic of symbols. But in the meantime, we must give out the astrology in these basic symbols, and if they are followed carefully by the pupils, a very necessary equipment in intuition will be established in them. Now, I know this is a subject that seems abstruse, but I also know that every single one of you need it. That you expect, fed back to you from the unconscious, something put on a plate. You will not get it like that. Never. Accessibility of energy. It's very easy for the roving yogi to drop in at a group and demonstrate pranayama. I myself have given you examples in healing courses of how to obtain access to energy for short periods of time. But the quality of energy that you get from pranayama, or indeed just from straightforward breathing exercises, can vary a lot. And generally it is of an order restricted to the lower planes. And the energy that we mostly need is the sort of energy that refreshes the mind and can be a creative stimulus. We've all understood somewhat now the meaning of the muses, the great inspirers of the arts and sciences of mankind. And of course, our mythologies indicate that the muses cannot be conjured up. They cannot be ordered around. They're necessary, they have to be present, but artists, poets like Milton, all say that they must wait for the muses before they can begin to create their masterpieces. Well, we're entering a new age, the age of Aquarius, the age whose catchword is, I know. And the young people today must know. They want to know. It's one of the reasons why prayer is not regarded with such appreciation by the young people of today as it was during the Piscean age. Many parents expect too much of their children to accept things on faith that were accepted quite easily a generation ago, but today they're not accepted. And it's because the young people of today are being flooded with Aquarian energies, the energies of the new age that demand that they use, and through them they demand to know the facts and come to their own conclusions. That's how they like it. And if you look at your own children, you will find this is very, very true. Give us the facts and we'll come to our own conclusions. And they don't like you to be dishonest in giving them the facts. They like you to give them all the facts. They like to make the decisions themselves. And that is very true of young people. And if you want to understand them, you should have that uppermost in your minds. A new age is upon us. The old methods of prayer are slowly being swept aside. the churches are hard-pressed to gain the interest of the young people, and even more hard-pressed to maintain it. And every Sunday night it's a source of great amusement to our ashram to see what sort of device the churches will produce on the television programs that night to try and hold attention. They will use every conceivable device, every gimmick, paying high fees to popular stars to present anything in the form of a Christian program to hold the interest. And of course it doesn't work. You cannot flog a dead horse and expect results. The age of Pisces is dying rapidly. The new religions will have to bring in a better knowledge of the energies that are available to man. They will, it is said, deal with color and sound and magnetism. And prayer will be replaced by meditation. This in the new millennium that lies ahead of us. Of course, the old concept of prayer tended to escape the understanding of the priests of the various religions. It was so easy for them to say, well, there's an anthropomorphic being called God, and when he glances at you, you're flooded with his energy. And if you're very good, he will look at you. And if you're very bad, he won't look at you. And if he ignores you, then you'll end in hell. And then the various religions taught that if they loved God, their concept of him, which for the Christians took the shape of the symbol of the cross, or for the Muslims took the shape of the crescent, moon and star. And so associated with these religions were various images which were adopted: the Madonna and Child, the seated Buddha, the wheel representing rebirth, or the chakras, the lotuses. Great lotus of Egypt, whose shape itself represented the Nile Delta, the long stalk of the lotus representing the Nile River running almost due north. So straight is the Nile, in fact, that it is suggested that in the age of the really great Egyptians, the Atlanteans, that they straightened the course of the Nile and made it run due north for esoteric reasons. Generally speaking, the occult background to prayer is that a person can pray either negatively or positively. And when he prays positively, he visualizes, if he's a Christian, Jesus or the cross or the Virgin and Child or some symbol of the religion. And as he prays fervently, repeating again and again, this is terribly important, so many Hail Marys, repeating them again and again, he of course is undertaking an esoteric process. He is donating energy to this image. Whatever image it is that he holds within his mind, as it were, he is donating energy to it. He is praying positively. And as the process goes on down through the ages, there becomes associated with repetition a tremendous numinosum of energy, a reservoir of energy associated with each of the religious images. We call that positive prayer. People go to church on a Sunday, well-meaning individuals, Often of them, they've never heard of anything esoteric, and they give of themselves. And they're stimulated to do this by being told that they should praise God, that they should love Him, that they should respect Him, and all these tones of behavior have the effect of stimulating an outpouring from them. And so there have been built up these huge reservoirs of energies in the inner planes. And when man prays negatively, he draws on them. He pulls energy down from them. And so a beam of timber falls on somebody, on a boy. The father rushes up and begins to pray for help, guidance, how to free his son. Now he visualizes again the Virgin Mary, Madonna and Child, or the cross, calls for strength, calls for help, and he is praying negatively, calling back energy to himself. Sometimes it works. Sometimes under a religious period of great aspiration and prayer, there is a downflow of energy. Sometimes it will take up visual images in his consciousness so that he feels that he is helped by the face of Jesus being present and so on. Very little of this is understood by the churches, more's the pity. And I have met many individuals in the churches, enlightened beings, like Dr. Curtis in Dallas, whose new church, Unity Church in Dallas, has our 12 stained glass pictures of the zodiac in it. And also other very fine beings have lectured on our platforms at festivals. John Rankin of the Unity Church in Houston, for instance. But even they tend to lose sight of the esoteric principles involved in obtaining access to energy. And in the New Age, as the shift of focus of young people is more away from I believe to I know, we need to have a better knowledge, understanding of how these processes of energization can work. We all know that our subrace is desperate for energy. So massive are the expenditures of energy that we make in everyday living that we're all of us desperately hard put to it to obtain a restoration of the energy that we lose. And so the talk that we're concerned with here today is a very pragmatic one. It's a very pragmatic one. We've just about exhausted our understanding of nutrition. It's all been worked out. The calories and everything have been assessed. The distribution of the amino acids, the mechanisms involved in breakdown of protein and carbohydrate and fats, and so on. There'll be no breakthrough in the next 100 years in nutrition. It's as dead as a dodo as far as obtaining further understanding of energy contents of food. Metabolism is a science that is practically worked out like inorganic chemistry. We know everything about it. And so man is going to be forced to look for new sources of energy. These are going to be from the numinostic levels that we're talking about here. And what we're concerned with today is how to tap them. Not waiting for the muses to come, although it's very pleasant to have a room of one's own, to place flowers in it, to put crystals in it that catch the glint of the sun's rays, to use incense, to wash ourselves carefully, to put on fresh linen, perhaps of an orange color. With all these magical devices, we try and encourage the muses to visit. Try and create conditions around us which put us in a state of grace to receive a downflooding of energy. And a lot of it works, there's no doubt about that. Just to be able to get into a high place. Remember Capricorn in the 10th house, MC, midheaven, high places, helps. But with the New Age, I'm not satisfied with current knowledge, nor is Jung, and nor will the young people be satisfied. Calling upon priests to supply them with energy, or the know-how of obtaining it. They want to get it themselves, and rightly so. What we do know about these energy stores has greatly been enhanced by Professor Carl Jung. It's very hard to discuss them without having to revert to the use of some of the rather abstruse terms that he uses. We only know this, that if an action is repeated again and again, just as the brain cortex will tend to remember it, and you will tend to be good at it if you practice it often enough, you lay down tracks in the brain which enable you to repeat it again with increasing perfection. We also know that repeated actions accumulate energy at an inner level. But always remember that everything that surrounds us has hidden energy content. Words are like icebergs. A word is like the visual part of the iceberg, that which we hear. And what we tend to lack is an understanding of the hidden part of the iceberg, the hidden nature of things. And the Theosophical Society performed a great service in the first part of this century in providing people with the understanding of the hidden nature of things. The hidden nature of things. And so when we repeat something, there is an accumulation of energies which seem to then feed the generations of persons who come after us. It's as if man learns to do something and passes it on from deep levels to the generations ahead of him. His ability to ride horses, the various actions that occur in his everyday life accumulate energies inwardly which tend subsequently to press outwards for expression. We call them, these expressions, instincts. What has been performed by a species for hundreds of centuries, assisting it in its survival, is passed on. We talk about instincts. energies pressing out from the unconscious of the species of the animal and guiding it. We ourselves have impinged upon us very little in the way of instinct. And still less in the way of reflexes. Push a finger into the hand of a baby, push a finger into the hand of a baby, and the child automatically will grasp the finger, as if clutching, so they say, the hair on the animal's back from very ancient times. We, however, want to know more about these energies that are available to us. And Jung has led the belief, the understanding, that the energies are there and they come to us as images. They come to us as images. So we get a numinostic energy, begins to present itself to us as an image. And these images may go on at a fairly low level to press as instincts and drives, and they affect the disposition of our personalities. They affect the dispositions of our personalities. In addition to these outflows of energies coming from the unconscious, which predispose our personalities, there are factors from our environment, our education, our parents. And together, what is coming from within and from the environment gives us the personality. What I'm concerned with here today is not to go over what Jung has said. I do want to emphasize that where you get a group of these instincts, they can form a complex. We talk about the Oedipus complex. And to quote a very easy one that we can understand, there is what we call the apprenticeship complex. We see little boys growing up wanting to be like their fathers. What the father says has numinostic value to the boy. What he does, everything that emanates from the father, tends to have special significance. It activates the complexes hidden in the boy's background. We talk about these complexes as the apprenticeship complex. We'll deal with that on some other occasion. And so, we have man's consciousness being predisposed by complexes that lie in the unconscious, and some complexes are even conscious. A person is embarrassed by, the boy might be embarrassed in the presence of girls. It's an obvious complex, it's in consciousness, but there are many that are hidden or repressed. And so we get the idea of a personality. Now, in astrology, we relate these complexes to aspects in astrology. And it is part of the task of our ashram, our work, to try and recognize the many complexes that impinge upon us and on our children, our family, and try and assess them by giving them astrological terms. Today we dealt, for instance, with the manifestation of hysteria. But hysteria itself is the outer expression of some sort of complex. Many women have an instinctual desire to dominate a partnership. And if they can't get it by direct action, by their attractiveness and the usual devices, then they will resort to manifestations of it which may present as hysteria. What I'm concerned with here today is not with these many psychiatric complexes which we have begun to correlate with astrology. For instance, there is the Faust complex, and none of us can get very far in our study of esoteric matters without coming up against the Faustus complex. A perfectly ordinary human of a very scientific outlook who wishes to know everything, hence its relevance to the Aquarian age. I know Aquarius. He wants to know everything. And he bargains with the devil. Give me all knowledge, all power, and you can have my life after death, if it exists at all, he says to himself. And so he gets it, all knowledge and all power. He alienates to himself the powers of God. The Faustus complex. Pluto in Gemini in the 10th midheaven. The apprenticeship complex that I mentioned a moment ago. Venus in Leo in the 3rd. Then there's the complex that sometimes afflicts brothers. We call it the Cain complex, Cain and Abel, the derivation from a Hebraic myth, the hatred of one brother for another, showing as jealousy, perhaps rivalry, and so on. Mars conjunct Venus in Pisces in the 3rd. More recently, we've had the UFO complex, a complex arising out of a messianic desire for wholeness and experiencing imagery of wholeness in full consciousness as whirling discs or rotating spheres and such like scintillating manifestations of the complex. Pluto in Taurus in the 8th, the UFO complex. And so on. And it's a very important work because it brings astrology into close relationship with psychology. And after all, that's the great plum in the esoteric world, is to be able to interpret a horoscope which can tell us an enormous amount not available to ordinary psychologists, interpret a horoscope in psychological terms, and to be able to give advanced information on complexes that will be presenting themselves or lie latent in our unconscious. So we think that we have a very exciting manifestation of the new age, the ability to correlate psychological complexes with astrological aspects. Now, we move over to consider the more esoteric aspects of our subject. Quite a long time ago, I became very interested in the phenomenon of numinostic energy, and it occurred to me that the way to learn to control the inflow of it into myself, into anybody, would be to observe the mechanisms by which it functions and operates. And so I carried out an experiment to observe something of this. And my method was to take the Morse code, a system of dots and dashes correlated to the alphabet, and to present them to the unconscious. And then, with the kind of mind that I have, controlled mind that I have, to observe what would come back. We've already seen from my earlier illustration that positive prayer puts things into the unconscious, and that negative prayer can draw things out of the unconscious. But that the process, by virtue of the nature of religion, is very restrictive. And so that it occurred to me that if I could present the letters of the alphabet in Morse to my unconscious, I could observe what would be returned to me. And we might then be able to discover whether there were certain sounds or certain images being presented to the unconscious which might be more numinostic in the resulting output from the unconscious, and therefore have some use to us. It's a difficult subject. People present questions to the higher self, and they expect answers in terms of our world. They want answers that conform to length and breadth and height. They want answers that have meaning to us in terms of the education we've been given at our schools. They want answers that fit in nicely to our concept of personality consciousness. They become disheartened when they pose something in a meditation, like a cross, and get back something they don't understand. They think, I'm all messed up. I need to purify myself further and try again. It may be, and I'm sure it is, that the average esoteric student, even the advanced ones, don't understand the process involved in presenting the unconscious with something. Because that's how the unconscious expresses itself. It needs to be stimulated from our waking world. It needs it. Change can only come to it by enactments going on in the conscious world. And so it occurred to me that if I took something very mundane, very ordered, like the Morse code, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It occurred to me that if I presented these symbols to the unconscious, I might be able to watch what would come back and be able to measure the degree or the amount of energy associated with what came back. Now, I know this sounds abstruse, but you must just understand that you can't have everything easy all the time. And so, if we took, for instance, and I have already done this in the ashram, if we took, for instance, the letter C, da-dit, dash dot, the letter C, we could present it in our diaries to the self, to the higher self. The higher self is always communicating with us. Communicates in dreams, waking dreams especially, vrittis, in hypnopompia and in esopompia, the period of coming into consciousness from deep sleep in the morning. The higher self, I'm talking about you now, communicates with you. The period of going to sleep at night, the higher self communicates. It's about the only opportunity it's got to reach you consciously. And if you communicate with it, and we're communicating with it all day long, and more so when we practice something spiritual. Anything practiced spiritual is part of a dialogue with the unconscious or with the higher self. Compassion is establishing a dialogue with the higher self. The use of will to good is establishing a dialogue with the higher self, an immensely old being that has taken hundreds of lives to grow, to manifest. And he has grown as the result of the dialogues established by each life on earth. We dealt with this last night. He is an immensely old being, your higher self. He's not interested in English, nor in French, nor in Hindustani. He's interested in eternal values. And so, the sort of language that he is likely to respond to is symbol. Symbols that don't change. Life after life, we use different languages, but the symbols tend to be the same. The symbol of procreation, the symbols of nutrition, the symbols of homeostasis that have accompanied us for hundreds and hundreds of lives. These are what the higher self wants to communicate through and to feed us energy with. And so you might present dash dot, or C in your diary, or you might say the word C, visualize the letter C, or you might say da-dit, da-da-da-dit, da-da-da-dit, da-da-da-dit. And whilst you are sounding that, you may at the same time concentrate strongly on the letter C. Now what would come back? What would come back? And what would come back would be important, because if you could observe the response to each letter of the alphabet, and you could record the images that came back, well, then you have an alphabet. An alphabet not in dot dash, but an alphabet of images, an alphabet of images. And where there is an alphabet common to two people, they can establish communication. I want to remind you that this was an exercise that I was engaged in for a long time. In an initial attempt, before the astrology, an initial attempt to establish a dialogue of communication with a higher self, not for me, but for students everywhere. It was not to be, but the work that was done was valid. And it's interesting and might be of assistance to you. I think it could be. The first thing that came back straight away was a pair of spectacles. A pair of spectacles. A pair of spectacles. Or what do you call it? A lorgnette. Which is dash dot dash dot. But taken and altered. That's what you have to understand with all images. That they are not the same. They're constantly changing, but retain the basic meaning. I see, pair of spectacles. See with the spectacles. And so several meanings are given there. The dash dot is not denied. The morphology is still there. Now that's the sort of thing that you have to understand when you begin to probe the unconscious. That is what you must expect. Or another image, the sea. I see the sea. Another image that comes back. Another image, two claws. Two claws. There it is. See, a claw, two claws, Cancer, the sign of Cancer. And Cancer rules clawing. And especially the clawing of a kitten feeding at the teat. Clawing. C for Cancer. C-A-N-C-E-R, two C's. Cancer rules the sea. Shallow sea. And in our astrology, it's the shallow sea, the shallow green sea. It's the sea that goes only to a depth that will support wildlife, shellfish, crabs, Cancer the crab. The sort of sea that you were seeing all around you in Greece. And so